Hello, how ya doing? This is Jeffrey Lee Folschinsky, your nautical navigator of nonsensical knowledge, and I've set my joy engine to full steam ahead as I welcome you to another episode of Meaningless Minutia, a show that dares to navigate the iceberg-filled ocean of unfantastical factoids while being blindfolded the entire time. And with that kooky confessional of craziness thrown out there, let's get down to this week's question. Did you know someone once tried to make an aircraft carrier out of ice? War sometimes tests the imagination of people participating in it. This seemed to be especially true during World War II, where we saw the introduction of radar, computers, and penicillin that changed the world as we know it. Of course, there's always times when there might have been a little bit too much imagination. With such inventions such as the scooter-mounted cannon, the one-wheeled tank, and a hot air balloon bomber. But the strangest example of thinking outside the box has to be the British attempting to build an aircraft carrier out of ice. The idea came from the result of successful German U-boat attacks happening outside the range of British aircraft. The answer to the problem was to build more aircraft carriers. The only problem was steel and other building materials was in short supply. Enter Jeffrey Pike, an inventor employed by the British military who came up with the idea of a floating airstrip made out of an iceberg so the aircraft could increase their range to cover the mid-Atlantic gap that the Allied aircraft couldn't cover. As wacky as this idea sounded, it wasn't the first time it was proposed, with the Germans even experimenting with the idea before the outbreak of the war. With limited options at the time, Pike was given the go-ahead. The first problem he found, though, was icebergs were too small to build a realistic airstrip on. The other, and arguably bigger problem, was the constant changing nature of icebergs, such as them turning over and splitting apart. For this idea to work, an iceberg was going to have to be built from the ground up. The problem with doing this was freezing water and keeping it frozen was proven problematic, so Pike came up with a new building material called Pykrete, a combination of water and wood pulp that when frozen was stronger than regular ice and was slow to melt. It was said that one admiral, wanting to demonstrate the strength of this new building material, took out a gun and fired it at a normal block of ice, instantly shattering it. When he repeated this action with the Pykrete, the bullet bounced off of it and hit another admiral in the leg. A scaled model was built in Canada because, well, it's cold there and they knew a lot about ice. This test model went through numerous tests to see if it would survive various forms of attack. And while it did survive these tests, several practical problems came to light. Mainly, keeping Pykrete at a stable temperature would require a refrigeration unit installed. Another was steering this massive aircraft carrier would require an engine on each side of the boat or one of the biggest rudders ever built. The most concerning problem, though, was cold flow, which is the tendency of a solid material to deform under influences of permanent stresses, mainly the sea crashing against it. It was determined that steel reinforcement would be required, which sort of negated the whole reason they jumped down this rabbit hole to begin with. But even with these issues, a prototype was built on Lake Patricia in Alberta, Canada to further test its viability. By this time, though, long-range aircraft had improved, making the bird ship, as it was called, unnecessary. Also, it was discovered that the infrastructure of steel, reinforcement, and other valuable wartime materials that would be required was too great, so the project was abandoned. But before you go passing judgment, the idea wasn't without merit, as the Canadians discovered when it took 3 hot summers before the prototype melted, a slowly fading monument to the impractical imagination. Okay, I can feel you're making your way to the mental lifeboat, so I best just stop there. But before you start pushing those women and children out of the way, let me leave you with this coked-out muse of mansplaining. The Titanic had its own newspaper printed on board, which makes you wonder, what was its last headline? And with that, I'm Jeffrey Lee Folschinsky saying, adios, amigos.